Mike, you're never going to believe this.
What?
I was sleeping. All right, man. Yeah, I mean, I think you should go first because I could use a minute to reflect.
You just woke up? Are you a coffee drinker?
Yeah, but I usually wait until midday to start drinking coffee.
Gotcha. All right. Well, so probably the most interesting thing from this past week since the last time we talked was Jenny and I joined Razben and then his wife working a booth at a cannabis festival in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania.
Yes, he told me about that. Now, when you say in the middle of nowhere, are you talking like fields, farms, forests? How far away? Give people an idea.
All right. That's I love to paint the picture, so I appreciate you giving me that opportunity. So it was in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania has like a wide continuum of out in the middle of nowhere. You know, like compare like the two biggest cities would be Pittsburgh and Philly. And so maybe 25 miles, 50 miles outside of there, like from that perspective, that's in the middle of nowhere. And so for me, living in Lancaster, which to some is in the middle of nowhere, I look at Kutztown. That part of the state is the middle of nowhere, but it's at a very interesting place. There's an interesting place. This part of Pennsylvania is probably going to include, let's say, Reading, Kutztown, Pottstown, Allentown. Like, unless you're from the area, like maybe those cities you've never even heard of, but they're in an interesting part of the geography of the state. And we can kind of get into its energetics. This area is north of the 40th parallel. It's north of the route Highway 76. That's the turnpike in Pennsylvania. It's north of that, but it is underneath one of the Appalachian ridges. So the Appalachian Mountains, they're not like how you picture the Rocky Mountains or any of these like really like breathtaking peaks where you can see individual mountains. The Appalachians, like it almost looks like if you were to take a rug and kind of like push it together where you get folds in it. There are these long ridges of, I don't know, hundreds of miles of continuous, like just like this one big like mountain. And so this area is all on the outside of that particular boundary. And this deals a lot with energies. Like we can imagine just like the very existence of like what naturally shows itself. Like, that's a reflection of a type of geometric energy. So we're right on the outside of that, but it's not really part of which has been built up into like Philadelphia and like that, the lower part of Pennsylvania. So that energy has been really, really impacted just by like modern living, buildings and like high density. And so when you get out into the middle of nowhere, and particularly when they're towns, because these are all cities and towns, it's a little bit closer to like natural systems, natural energies, natural that they're going to be more available and more obvious. And because this is closer to the mountains, like that kind of changes it as well. So that whole area, like I know there's something unique about it and something which I don't really experience where I'm living in Pennsylvania. And these areas are kind of known for like, particularly like Reading. Reading has a very strong history and reputation of like, of dark magicians and witchcraft and stuff like that. There's an elite prep school known as the Hill School, which is right in the midst of this area. And of the elite prep schools, like the elite, almost all of them are found in New England, yet this one is in Pennsylvania. And so that to me, like, is significant, and it kind of points to like, you know, some deeper levels of significance. And there's like a really well-known cavern. It's called Crystal Cave around there. There's a whole bunch of interesting things there. But where this particular event took place in Kutztown, we're, I don't know, maybe like 15 miles away from something which is known as Indiantown Gap. And Indiantown Gap is, I mean, you could probably ascertain just by listening to the word. Indiantown Gap is, first, it's a gap. So on this long continuation of, you know, these ridges that make up the Appalachians, there's a gap. It's flat. There's a break in that. And so that's a portal in the most, you know, literal definition. From one section to another, you pass through it, and a portal is a portal is a portal. It's a doorway. And so it has that, you know, that quality built into it. And then, you know, just from a practical, mundane state or perspective, this part of the world, like, is where people would naturally go if you move primarily by walking, because, you know, it's a whole lot easier to pass through this area than it would be to climb over the mountain. And so, you know, it's always had that sort of purpose. And so, back in the colonial times, like, by the name Indiantown Gap, you know that there were a lot of the pre-colonial people were living there. It was a significant location. And, you know, that's always a good, you know, that to me is a good marker of an energy to investigate. But then, since then, it is now the home of the Pennsylvania National Guard, and I think it also has some other military significance. So this kind of fits in the whole narrative where army bases, military bases, Walmarts for that matter, are built upon significant areas, because, you know, unless you're on that base, unless you're part of that world, you're really not going to have access to the Indiantown Gap. So all that being said, I see that as the primary, like, energy marker for this particular region. And then it is within that general scope is where we find this, I think it was called Cannafest, in Pennsylvania. And keep in mind that Pennsylvania is not a recreational state, but it is a medical marijuana state. So there's, like, you know, there are some boundary points there, like, from a legal perspective. So that is where where we find the place. And I'm going to pause for a second, because I want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions about the geography I just painted. But then I want to go into the event itself, and then what came out from it. So any thoughts?
I have driven through the area. I will say, you know, nothing stood out at the time, but the mountainous region, it is strange to see, like, it's almost like, you know, the ridge is just looming in the periphery. You can't drive over it or drive through it like you can some mountains. At least that's what I, you know, experienced driving north from where you're at. And then I'm also noticing that the Schuylkill River is along the Reading, this whole kind of area, the Lehigh Schuylkill River is crossing through. Now I wonder, though, why they have two different names for the Schuylkill River.
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer for that. In fact, I could go down. I've been asking the same thing, because I saw a river which I know change names on Google Maps over the past year, and I'm like, how does this happen? But But I want to go back to the Schuylkill. So the Schuylkill goes kind of like through Reading, Pennsylvania, and then it connects down to the Delaware right in Philadelphia. If you know where the airport is, like in that general sort of area. Mm-hmm. And there used to be, that's where all the football stadiums and the baseball stadiums, like that's a strong energy point. That's where we have the airport is there in that general area. And they used to have a stadium, an indoor stadium, which probably, I don't know, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was definitely the 60s and 70s was like the premier like place you would go and have like a concert or something in the Philadelphia area. But they tore it down maybe about 10 years ago. It was called the Spectrum. And so Spectrum has like an indication in its just the root. Spectrum comes from spirit, so it like kind of hints at that spiritual world in a deeper level. And the word Schuylkill means hidden. It's the hidden river. And, one perspective could be like, this was a hard river to find, or it's really well guarded by the trees in the way some of the other rivers were not. And that makes it hidden. Or you could look at hidden as like indicating like where hidden means the occult, behind the veil, that which is not necessarily seen. And so I've always looked at like with the Schuylkill and at the Delaware and that part of Philadelphia as being like, having great, like a significant esoteric sort of purpose, even just in the names, but then the actual bodies of, geography, bodies of water, bodies of land themselves. But the Schuylkill River is, goes through this area. And I think that's another indication. Like this area is if you drive through it, you don't think much of it. But when you start looking at it, like there's a lot more beneath the surface, and some of it is kind of creepy, I suppose. But like that's the whole idea of like anything you can't see always has a creepy element. You go into a dark basement, there's a bit of creepiness to it just because you can't see it, and so this area does have that, but that doesn't necessarily mean dangerous.
Mm. Yeah, no, I certainly remember feeling something particularly strange about the river when I was on the banks near the Philadelphia Art Museum, and just kind of looking into the black water. I think it's black water, which is a type of river that leaches tannins from the many trees along its banks.
Huh.
But I and to me, where I'm from, we don't have any blackwater rivers. I don't know if that's a New England thing, but can't say I've seen any blackwater rivers. Maybe it was just a cloudy day, but that's my initial thought there. But yeah. So tell me more about Cannafest. What was going on with that?
So we go there. So the place is held at a like the back lot of a farmer's market and antique kind of place, kind of run down, lots of stands where farmers could go and maybe wholesale sell their goods and stuff like that. And we're on the back side of it, and there are two very big pavilions. And when I drove up, it was a shared booth. It was a shared booth where someone local invited Roz to join in, and then Roz was like, "Hey man, this is kind of your neck of the woods. Would you want to come by too?" So like that's kind of what brought me into it. And so I've been to, a decent number. I like to go to fairs and festivals of all types because I just love being around like mixes of people, and I like to look at goods, and like there's something about that experience which definitely tickles me as like an individual. And I've got a point of reference. Like I know what sort of festivals are around this area. I know, just a sense of like what big looks like, what small looks like, what the energy of the people look like, and so forth. And to be quite honest with you, so I was curious about this. I was curious about this for two reasons, because there's a bit of or at least to me, it seemed paradoxical. I was like, on one hand, this is in the middle of nowhere, and like, who's going to go and drive and go to this place. It's going to usually, like, people who come to a festival will probably drive, let's say, 25 miles from their home. And so I'm thinking, what's 25 miles around this place? It's not going to be a lot. But that being said, like a cannabis festival, like, is, and particularly in Pennsylvania, where it's still not like completely legal, though I can remember like 5 years ago, just like what it would be like if someone was smoking pot out in the open, and like, the amount of awareness you might have, and versus now, like, that thing, the amount of pressure has reduced considerably, but it's still not like totally legal. And so I'm like, what is this going to be like? I'm curious about that. Are people going to come from all around just because this is, more of a taste within Pennsylvania of maybe what a total, at least cannabis freedom environment may look like? So anyway, so I'm curious, what's it going to be? I drive up to the place. We were one of the first vendors to set up on Friday. So when we left on Friday, like, I had no idea what this was going to be. And when I showed up on Sunday, I was only there for one day. When I showed up there, the thing was friggin' massive. Like, I was blown away by just everything, like how many people were there, how many vendors were there, just the overall vibe. And so my initial reaction was like, wow, this is exciting, particularly, how much public events have kind of changed over the past 18 months. So walked around, me and Jenny walk around, we have a great time seeing all sorts of different people. And then we settle into like where the booth is. And so we sit down next to Roz and his lady, his queen. And I start to like really study the event from maybe a different perspective of like, all right, well, I'm selling some of my books, and like, I don't really know what to expect. And I'm just watching how this whole, like, what is this setup? Because there's my first observation was noticing this balance, or this dance, which was happening between what I would call, like kind of authentic stand folks. These are probably people that this is how they make a lot of their livelihood and how they live, like going to different festivals, selling their wares. They're like pros at it. And primarily selling like cannabis related stuff, and then like secondary things, like maybe a little bit of mystical stuff spilt over in there, like rocks and crystals and stuff like that. So that was a part of it. And there was like this really, really interesting mix, and a lot of like, a lot of vendors just like making and selling their own stuff, both THC and CBD is what I saw, but like kind of like on the down low with the THC, but it was like kind of, you don't want to make a big deal about it, but it's not also, it's not exactly hidden, but it's not exactly an open air drug market. But nonetheless, so there was that. And then there was this, like, what I would call the corporate CBD and cannabis movement. And so that would be all of, like, in Pennsylvania, like the dispensaries, or like, a really well-funded CBD grow, because that was around there. And you could tell the difference between the professional
Canna Bros?
Travelers. Well, the professional travelers, the guys who like, they break up, they go to the different festivals. And then like, yeah, like the pro grade stuff by looking at what their setup looked like. Because I've also been to many, like Fortune 100 expos. And so I know what that environment is like too, in like high technology, or like even within like medical devices. And so this had that vibe to it. This had like, it's totally corporate. And I'm looking at this thing. So I'm first looking at it from that perspective. and kind of seeing like how that bumps in, like, just the people who are manning the booth. And I'm not saying this like judgmental, like, this is better than that. I'm saying this in terms of like, what is the zeitgeist of this? What is the feeling of this type of environment and how they meet? Because they're complementary. And the ultimate takeaway on this segment, before I get into the people who are there, was this, that particularly as things become potentially much more regulated, whether that be with passports and travel and stuff like that, going to like public places, going to the mall, going to things like that, these types of cannabis festivals are going to probably be one of these last like gray areas where different worlds can intermingle rather easily. And the reason why I say that is there is such a government push behind the professional legalization of marijuana and like dispensaries, and that's going to allow these festivals to continue to happen because they have a vested interest, because this is kind of like this meeting area. This is why I was talking about portals. This is where we're seeing this one marketplace, or this one community, if you will, this kind of like when cannabis was completely illegal, like that type of festival had a very different vibe. And now it's kind of like blurring over between like this one pocket of like more of a natural type of community and culture is becoming, it's becoming mixed in with the legal world and, being brought into the fold. And I'm watching that happen. So without even getting into that, what we do know is there's going to be a time and a place that this is going to continue to exist as it exists, where it's kind of like, there's an agreement that this is going to happen. And there's, as I said, like it wasn't exactly an open air drug market. You're not exactly supposed to be able to go and openly sell THC product in Pennsylvania yet, but it's agreed that, if you're not going to talk about it, this can happen. So there's this blending area. And my sense is, as things, as life unfolds, that this is going to be a nice avenue which people are going to be able to interact under that umbrella with a little bit more freedom outside of just like anything related to cannabis. So that was the first point, and I took away from that experience. Yeah.
You're bringing to mind like something that I thought about a little bit over the past few months is like Pennsylvania being in a as above, so below sort of way, like a microcosm for the rest of the United States. And you see on two borders, right? Well, not two. Washington, D.C. doesn't quite border Pennsylvania, but it's close enough. And then New Jersey, both states, D.C. technically not a state, but they have legal cannabis. New Jersey has legal cannabis. My state has it now. I think if Pennsylvania does it, Mike, the rest of the country is going to follow suit pretty quickly, because Pennsylvania, for being, leaning one way politically, is very balanced, as far as demographic goes. It's like you have a big representation of rural people, mountain people, city people, suburb people, like it just, I feel like Pennsylvania kind of is an American state in that sense.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I never thought that there was, as soon as this became like, as soon as anything becomes politicized, like, it's no longer grassroots. And as soon, like it was, the legalization of cannabis is like, it's not a grassroots sort of thing. I mean, you have to, if you're watching this, you realize, you have to realize that. I mean, and look at all of the people who are becoming it. And this line of like corporate grows versus like, regardless, like that, that's a different discussion. But you're absolutely right. Like Pennsylvania, I think is a good like timeline marker in terms of like how much this is going to like unfold across America. But when I was talking about these festivals, I'm not limiting it to Pennsylvania. I'm talking about like all of them, and like regardless of the legality. What was clear to me was because Pennsylvania, there's a legality issue, but there isn't any sort of legality issues in some of these other states. You got a different flavor of how this was still allowed to just happen, even if it's not totally legal. But but the real thing is this dance between when this festival cannabis sub kind of culture becomes totally like mainstream. It becomes totally mainstream, totally corporate, totally. And so that's like the window. And I think that these events, like particularly if you see these events, like, they're managed usually by promoters, and they're larger ones and smaller ones. But this is a particular type of event in which people are still meeting that underneath that umbrella, regardless of what state. If you see where these are happening, these are going to be, I say this with a little bit tongue in cheek, but safe space for people to kind of like meet and meet other people of like-mindedness, because that's not the coffee shops anymore. That's not all of these other places where people used to meet. And as that's becoming tougher and tougher, and stranger, this particular environment, I think, is going to be an infrastructure for other types of, just meeting the other travelers. And when I say that, I mean like understanding what's happening in this world right now. So that was one of the more exciting things for me to think about, because those are the sort of questions which I put in my mind. Like, okay, what's it going to look like over the next year? Like, as doors are open or shutting, what windows are opening, and you begin to see where the flow goes. So that was like the first thing. Like, when walking through the event, getting the lay of the land that way. And then when we sat down, really beginning to go and study who are the other attendees, the other people who are coming to this event. Right. And there I was a little bit, and this could very well be because of the part of the world it was, but there were probably, in the most simplistic way, like there were like 4 or 5 different demographics, which I would say 85, maybe even 95% of the goers went, the attendees of the event, I would put them in. And I'm saying this in levels of consciousness and how they're meeting reality. Like, you could just tell by the age and the dress and that sort of stuff, like, kind of where someone is in life. And for the most part, like, they want to go to a cannabis festival, but, this is just their target. It's no different than that. This is their identity, and this is, what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But within that group, and so this is what was so fascinating. So we have this in the midst of 200 vendors, and for the most part, everything was like really, really high quality, interesting goods, but it was all kind of like, as you would imagine, it would appeal to a cannabis audience. And then we have within these 200 booths, we have the booth which me, Ross, and Men's Soul Art, I believe that was the name of the name of the woman who had the booth. That was what her operation was known as. And so I'm watching the people come by, and we all have like this, not just kind of like mystical sort of, like if you were to go to a metaphysical show, like, all of, just as what we saw in the cannabis show, like where like, 9 out of every 10 booths is selling like, glassware or something along those likes. and much less would be like kind of mystical. If you were to go to like a new agey or mystic sort of fair, and I like to go to those too, is like, everyone there is selling like crystals or what things similar to that. And so Ross had a lot of like crystals around there and in the booth. And this was a rarity compared to the other booths that were in this place. But then nestled within his crystal display was a setup of his books, all about Mystic Philadelphia, and then his gem books, and then also his decoding the doggone and a lot of that type of history. And then you have my book on the rights to the 40th parallel. And Ross's book also, I think it's called Free Your Mound. But his work and my work, they are like, for lack of a better description, it's like advanced level mysticism. Like if we were to have our stuff at like a normal, like mystics fair, probably half of them, like it's not for them. They're like, this isn't my language. I want to go in maybe something a little bit like not as like in depth and detailed and all this sort of stuff. But for the people who it resonates with, it's a smaller percentage. And so we have in the middle of this huge like Cannafest sort of thing where that is the draw for most of the people. We have buried in the middle of it like this like really, really like deep sort of stuff. And if I do say this, like it was shown beautifully, like his work through the mixture of his crystals and some of his like handmade artifacts. And I had my quilted map of the Susquehanna River, and I got my like the John Smith map on there. Like it was really, really beautiful. But if you're not paying attention, if you're just walking around mindlessly, this is so easy. This is such a needle in the haystack, such a needle in the haystack. And so understanding what I'm bringing to the table, what Roz is bringing to the table, it's like, this is here. And anyone there had to have been, a couple thousand people in attendance, if not more. Like of the ones that would walk by, and only a small percentage of the people would even come into our booth. But of that, only a smaller percentage of those would actually like look at the books or look at the stuff we have there, and I would just watch their eyes. But you would see that. I could see that. I could see like, wow, this is a person like this resonates for. Like this is only going to resonate with like 0.001% of the population, and like that's one of them. And so every single time that there was like a meaningful conversation, whether it was me and the person or Roz and the person or Jenny and the person who came by, I'm like, this is like, there were so many loops and hoops that had to have been crossed for that person to come and to be touched by this and like for us to have an interaction. Like that to me was the real, that's what I'm seeing looking for these events where we can come together. When I'm saying events, it could be anything. When I say we, I just mean the like-minded, as we're beginning to like form those networks and however they would show. And I would say I probably had, I would say one really, really meaningful conversation where I was like, okay, I got the right information in the right person's hands at the right time. And so that to me, like made everything like this was the one reason why I went there, in terms of what I am to give. And then there was one thing for me to receive, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But that was the next level of the event. What are your thoughts on that and the people and that sort of stuff?
I love it. I love the picture you're bringing to mind of the serendipity that occurs in someone's life that would lead them to stumble across your work by accident, and then it happens to also be a good fit for where that person is in their actual reality. It's definitely, when it does happen, you got to be like, oh wow, all right. But yeah, it's bringing to mind, my position in New Haven for the past 10 years. I feel like so much goes on in this city that most people turn a blind eye to, And I've been sort of like, I can't leave. I gotta keep going to these used bookstores and get these weird books that always end up there for some reason, as Yaleys graduate and sell their books off. There's a Jesuit book here and a Skull and Bones book there. And, so I feel like without me in town, those books would just kind of go unnoticed until the next guy like me comes around in 5 years. So that's the feeling I'm getting right now. So you're describing this, the milieu of people and it's the right people who vibrate to the display almost. At 10, I've done similar things. I worked at a farmer's market selling bread, and then I had friends through the farmer's market who were starting kind of like their own smaller, decentralized farmer's market in a different town. And I said, well, I can't, bring my bread stuff there because I don't own the company, but I make, crystal wraps. I've showed you those before, I think.
Yes, you have.
So I sold some of my crystals there, and I realized pretty quickly that I had to adjust for who was there because I noticed this is a lot of families and kids. So I put, instead of my wraps out on the table, I put some of like the larger stones and the seashells and things that would appeal to the large amount of like younger folks that were in this particular farmers market's demographic, so to speak. But yeah,
listen to you merchandise. So you brought up, like going back to like the chapter before this when I was talking about like infrastructures. Used bookstores are definitely, I think, another one of these areas in which there's going to be, an infrastructure for finding the folks. And so that's really interesting. And it's a very, very kind of different vibe than like, let's say the pop-up sort of, traveling festival. This happened. I just want to throw this because you brought this up. I want to throw this quick story out. So, 2 or 3 days before the festival, Jenny and I were in downtown Lancaster, and we're like, "Hey, where should we go next?" So, like, we went and got a cup of coffee, and we were talking through some stuff, and we then were like. After that, we're like, we're down here. Let's go and have a little bit of adventure. And so we were right by a used bookstore. It was the used bookstore that I sent you and Tyra to.
The Dog Star.
Right, exactly. And this is one of my favorite used bookstores for a variety of reasons. Like both its layout, like it kind of has this really cool used bookstore feel to it, and then like the name of it, like all sorts of different things. So. We walk in, and I won't go into greater detail, but it was the first time in my experience that I was more or less like harassed and told to leave because I wasn't wearing a mask.
Mm.
And it was one of those things, and it got in my head. Like I thought about it a lot for like 2 days because it bumped up against a whole bunch of different, places for me, like, boundaries. I was like, because I liked that place. And then I was like, oh, and I'm like, this is also where this guy's world is. And he, it's his store. Like I respect that. And I look at that as a boundary of where I want to go or not. But then also I'm like, all these different things. So long and short of it is, it's interesting that you brought up like the used bookstore. But then, as another one of these vehicles, but then also a recognition of like, just being aware that these places are changing too. What I do think I want to do is next time I go to a used bookstore, I want to start like putting into the books that I find interesting. I'm just going to put in some of my Susquehanna Alchemy postcards, like the ones with the maps on them. Have you ever seen those postcards?
You've sent
and
me
I
them,
just
yes.
like for someone to find that, like I love that kind of like serendipity, like purposely playing serendipity. I'm going to put this in there. I don't know who's going to receive it. I don't know when they're going to receive it, but like, just playing that game of roulette.
I love it.
Can we go back to, we'll go back to the festival.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So I'm going to paint you one last like visual picture, and then I'm going to tell you what I got from there. So how I told you in the beginning, like it was held at this kind of rural auction location, like a very utilitarian place. There's some indoors and outdoors, and where how the festival was set up, they had it set up around these two very large pavilions, and these pavilions have roofs on them, but they're open air pavilions. The sides are open, and what was so nice about, and that was where the majority of the vendors were. So it was almost like being in an indoor mall, if you will. But then it was also surrounded by like pop-up tents and that type of environment, which you would see also in festivals. So it had this mixture of like walking through people's tents and being outside, but then also being able to go inside. But if you've ever been to like an indoor festival, like if it's in like a conference center or something like that, you're underneath the fluorescent lights, and there's no like real natural air. And this was like this perfect blend because it was open air. But it was covered, so like there was you're outside of the direct sunlight, and you felt like you were in part of something. And they had just the perfect amount of incandescent lights like strung up across these very large pavilions, so that it was natural light with a little bit of artificial light, but that was necessary. So the depths of it wasn't so dark. But it was the most perfect sort of environment, like this blending of indoors and outdoors. It has a real kind of like auctioneer vibe. Like there is something, at least within the history of our civilization narrative, of bazaars, of places where people come to like sell their wares. There's something about that which is deep within our history, regardless of the culture you come from. And so like this kind of tapped into that. And I personally, I still get, as I said, I feel that energy, and it's very exciting to me to be around all of that. So that being said, I had multiple hats when I went to this. I knew I was going to have multiple hats, and part of what's fun to go to a fair and a festival is to get a souvenir. You know, there's something like over the top with materialism, but then there's also a place within the human story where like materialism does, like, you know, it's not over the top, and souvenirs may be an example of that, a true souvenir which connects you to a time or an event. And so like getting like something which you take as a reminder from a place. And so for the most part, I'm walking around. I'm a really, really, really hold a high bar for what I'm going to buy. If I'm going to buy something, it's got to be good, whatever the thing is, like whatever my definition of good is. So I'm a discriminative buyer. And I'm walking around, I'm looking at all these booths. And for the most part, it's nothing which I really want to buy. And for the most part, they're all kind of the same. And for the most part, like I recognize that, you know, it's cool, and I love the people, and I love to see the stuff. But I'm like, I'm thinking this in my head. I'm like, I'm not gonna buy any of this. Like, I have no problem not getting a souvenir if it's not the right one. So walking all around, and then we get to this one booth. It's kind of tucked in the middle of all of these booths. And I really enjoy to notice now, you know, we live in the Etsy era. We're in post Pinterest era. And what I mean by that is like booths, there's an artistry which people bring to their booths. And a lot of people who sell their own crafts, like it's really, really cool to see this, like, you know, this real crafty sort of stuff. I've seen these in all these other booths. And I appreciate that. But then I find this other booth. And what this booth is, imagine if you had a cardboard box, a pretty big, heavy duty cardboard box, and you cut it out so that like it lays flat in the longest section possible. So it's probably, I don't know, like 3 feet by 2 feet, maybe 4 feet by 2 feet of cardboard of this what was once a cardboard box laid flat, and then there's an entire wall of text written in a big marker. Like someone went and they wrote out all of this stuff or this thing, and you can tell that it's old. Like it looks old. Like this is what they do. Like it's almost like a really, really good homeless person sign. Like if you see a good sign, you're going to stop and read it. Like at least I do. And so I see this and I read it, and it's this guy telling his story of his booth. And his story is basically this. It's I spent half my life in a village in Pucallpa, Peru, and I'm studying with his family, and I'm here and I'm selling my goods. And these are all goods which come from my Peruvian family. And I'm like, all right, hook, line, and sinker. I'm like, this is what I live for. I go because, and the town which he says in Peru, I've been in Peru once in my life, and the town which he said his family is in, it's a city, it's a smaller city, it's Pucallpa. It's not Lima, it's Pucallpa. It's not it's a lesser known, a tertiary city, and in Peru, and I'm like, that's my city, that's the one I went to. So I've got this connection, and I'm looking at all the stuff, and the guy there is probably, I'd say he's probably your age, and I asked, and he's a white dude, but he's dressed in all of real Peruvian inspired sort of clothes, like regular clothes, but I could see he's done his own embroidery on his jeans and stuff like that, if you're paying attention. And this is the guy. He's like, yeah, I live in Yonkers right now, and I grew up in the Northeast, but my life path took me down to Peru, and I resonated so deeply. I've spent the last 5 years living half my life there, and I resonate so deeply with it that these people took me into their life and they taught me their stuff, and so he's got that vibe there. And so I strike up a nice conversation with him. And there are a couple things which he had there, which were interesting. So some of the stuff was handmade, from his family, Peruvian sort of stuff. And then some of it, I think, was probably a little bit more commodified, Peruvian, gloves and stuff like that. But there's a mixture, and you could tell. And included in that mixture, there was this really nice collection of alpaca, woolen, beautiful blankets. And they're pretty reasonably priced. And so me and Jenny were we both like textiles. So we're okay, this is nice because, we like a blanket. Winter's coming up and we need the blanket. So there was that. But I'm also going through a pile. I had to dig through his table and then go through this pile of all of these hand woven textiles. And if you're familiar with the artistry and artistic styling of the Shipibo people of Peru, there's a certain style, and it's also very much tied in to the ayahuasca culture there. And this is a stack of these handmade Shipibo ayahuasca sort of art artifacts, if you will. They were just, circles that have been woven with designs upon them. And I'm going through them. I'm like, all right, I hit the jackpot here. This is exactly what I'm looking for. And whereas the blankets are, as I said before, kind of commoditized, this is immensely personal. And I'm going through, and then there's one that jumps out at me. And it's this circular one, probably, I don't know, let's say 8 inches in diameter. And I see on the back of it, there is a little piece of masking tape on the back, and there's a name written on the back. The name was Nalia, I believe. And none of the other ones had this, a name on the back. And so I knew this was the one I was going to get. It spoke to me on a couple of reasons. I'm like, if I'm going to get a souvenir, this is my souvenir. And I'm excited for it. And this is what I came for, because this is not something which I can find anywhere. This is a chance meeting on my end. And so I go and I'm talking to the guy. This is how I learned about him. We were talking for a little bit, and I show him the back of this round textile, and I'm like, "Who is this?" And then he starts telling me all about the woman. He's like, "Oh, this is Nalia, and she made it, and this is her age, and this is what she does, and this is where her specialties are, like in all aspects of her human story, if you will." And I'm like, "Do you have a picture of her?" And he's like, "Yes, I do." And he pulls this picture of on his phone of her. And I go and I look into the eyes of the person I'm holding a textile which she made in her hands. I don't know how long ago, but I'm making this sort of connection. And so I take this home. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? In fact, I put it in my hat. So I always wear a hat. And I wore it inside of my hat for that entire day. Just kind of, for whatever reason, like that felt to be like the right thing for me to do. And then I'm like, what am I going to go and do with this? And so what I did was I turned it. I took her art and then I applied it. I applied it to my own craft making. And so I made this collaborative piece, whereas I took hers and then I created a foundation in which it can sit upon. So I took two different pieces of fabric. One piece of fabric, which was from the church, which I spent 60 days in last year. And then a piece of fabric, which was like just a drop cloth. If you've ever seen like the canvas drop cloths you can use for painting, like commercial painting or regular painting, they're the best. I use those a lot for things. So I cut out two pieces, probably about 10 inches by 10 inches, same size. And then I affixed the circle onto it and then did my own weaving around it. And so this is now my collaborative piece with this woman who I don't know, other than the fact that we are speaking the same language of crafting, for lack of a different word, just like how musicians can play together and they're speaking in that language of music. This is a language of crafting. And so I've done that. And now this piece is going to be part of my practice. And I have just made this connection. This whole thing of what I've been describing to you, all about this, beginning with like Indian Town Gap, being in the portal of going from one side of one of the ridges to another side of one of the ridges on one of the oldest mountain chains on the entire earth. And then looking at the changing of times and infrastructures and ways which are going to connect and go through doorways, and then looking at people who are connecting with my work. And then I got to then be on the receiving edge and then be able to connect with another person's work. So that, my friend, that was the story which I wanted to share with you.
So many things to comment on. I think that's great because, especially considering you've been to that exact city. It's not the capital city, so the chances aren't too high. Yeah. You mentioned having a Chance meeting. Well, I had a meeting with Chance from the Innerverse podcast. Someone you're familiar with. Well
played.
You know Chance, right?
Oh, I know Chance very well. I'll talk about that once you're finished with this story, but yes.
So Chance and I both have podcasts. His podcast has been going on far longer than mine. I think he started in 2014. And somebody reached out to me and said, "Hey, I love all the work you're doing." I think this was one of the messages that I was looking for last week but didn't read.
Okay.
And he mentions you and Chance are my synchro gurus. So I'm like, okay, that's an odd thing to say, somebody calling me a synchro guru. I'm kind of just getting into all this stuff. So I'm like, well, if Chance is the other synchro guru, let me talk to this guy. And then I check out his show and I find out, he has a lot of the same friends and acquaintances that I do. So not only, has he had yourself on the show, he's had Lindsay Sharman, who I've also had on the show, Benjamin Balderson, Santos Bonacci, a bunch of people. So, excuse me. Long story short, we hit it off. It was a great conversation, and I think I inspired Chance to go out and investigate the Mississippi River and the area that he's in Missouri, somewhat, because I kept poking at him like, well, have you done this? Have you done that? And he answered twice. He said, well, come back to me, in a few months, and I'll be able to answer that better. So it was interesting.
When did you guys have that conversation?
This was Friday.
That was Friday. Okay.
And yeah, we ended up talking about several different things. One of the more interesting things that came out was his idea of parasites. And I kind of asked him, and I'm not sure how he answered it, whether it was directly or indirectly, but I asked him if he thought maybe parasites were connected to archons in some way, and then I think it was just out of nowhere, he says exactly what we were talking about on last week's episode, which was the idea that synchronicities can be, in some cases, not leading you to the best place. The way he put it was like, he thinks sometimes Team Dark sets up synchronicities to take us down the wrong path. So that was kind of the connection point there, because I don't think I had brought that up, but he did, and it was fantastic. And I'm getting the pictures right now of the cloth. Very cool. Wow.
So the second picture is the finish. So the difference between the first one and the second one are a couple lines on the border, and then the third one is the backside.
Right. So now it's now this half side on the back is yours, is what you're saying.
No. So the only thing so hers was the circle.
Oh, okay. I get what you're saying.
So I just had a circle, and you see how now it's all integrated, like it looks like one complete.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
It almost reminds me of Asian, like Japanese artwork in a way.
It certainly has a feel to it. I mean, well, Peru definitely has a strong, Eastern influence, just, being on that side of the Orient, or closer to by being on the West Coast of of America. So certainly there's lots of bleed over in cultures. So I heard from Chance this weekend too.
Right on.
Right. So it's interesting you said that. And then, and maybe this is, and I'm curious, he and I are going to do another show. I think we're doing it next week. But I'm curious, like the idea of parasites, I think about a lot. And I want to hear what he says, and maybe we'll talk about that. But now that we're talking, though, what I think is interesting, what you just brought up, ties in directly to the email which we received from our last conversation, right?
Yeah, I do. I do not remember the contents because I just wanted to have a more fresh response. But when I saw what it was about, I figured I would forward it to you so you would have a copy of it. And then,
all right. So I'll refresh your memory. It was about someone was asking us to talk about things within the conspiratorial world, which kind of muddy, ridiculous, outrageous claims that are mixed in with real sort of things worthy of investigation.
Before we get to because I just opened it up, and you're right, it's long, it's detailed, and it's very interesting.
But it's the same thing which you just talked about. And that's why this is the link I want to make, because we talked in our last episode, or our last show, we were talking about the idea of manipulated synchronicity. And so do we talk about the trickster archetype?
I think so. I don't know how much of that made it through because of that audio discrepancy that we talked about.
Right. But we talked about the trickster, and we talked about, like, you know, the idea, like, you know, what is the trickster and its purpose? And the trickster's purpose, you know, is the trickster a good guy? Is the trickster a bad guy? And, you know, ultimately it depends upon, like, you know, where you meet that. But I'm gonna suggest that, like, the same thing is true with the manipulation of, you know, the limited hangouts, the misinformation in the counterintelligence, if you will, within the conspiracy world, because that's what was asked about. Like, it's really the same sort of idea, the same archetype, the same energy of, like, kind of being messed with in a way. And then it begs, you know, then it begs you to take a step back and, you know, like, what is its purpose? What does it do? What does the trickster do?
It reveals.
Well, it depends upon what level, do you get tricked by it?
Yeah,
right?
It brings another level of awareness, in another word.
It either has to. It either has to. You either, like, whoa. I thought this was true and I trusted this, and, like, you know, this is where I got hooked, and then you tricked me. You know, that's the whole thing, like, trick me once, shame on you, trick me twice, shame on me. So the trickster, you know, by doing that, introduces you, like, to areas within your, to blind spots that you hold. Why are they blind spots? Because you've taken something something is true without examining it. And that is a universal truth. And then depending upon where you are in life, so that would be like, you know, first is you are the fool in the fact that you didn't even realize there are tricksters out there and you could get tricked. And then you could begin to learn, like, oh, wait, there are tricksters out there and they're tricking at any given time. And then, so you're kind of, like, you know, on guard, if you will. And then you get to a point that you realize the trickster is actually the person that allows me to see things as they are. And in fact, I would have never seen things as they were, as they are, how deep things go, if it wasn't for the trickster. And so and I'm not saying one's right or wrong, it's just, like, looking at this from different ways. And so if we can go and look at it from this very detached way, you know, that's true with the trickster, which is messing with synchronicity, or the trickster that's messing with, like, you know, with the narratives that are unfolding before our lives on the TV screen. Like, they're all making us become more and more aware, or it's going to at least meet us at a certain level or where we are. And then, to me at least, it then provides a greater clarity as to how do you want to play in this game.
I couldn't agree more. I'm just, I can't help but think of Sam, in a way, Sam Tripoli, as a trickster character. I went to see him perform live on Saturday night in New Jersey, and one thing that I'm starting to realize now, and it's to your point about the Cannafest Festival, where there's this new outlier sort of culture that's going to facilitate a real getting to know people rather than this fake, you know, corporate politicized version that they're pushing us towards through social media. There are going to be chances to find your tribe, so to speak, and find your community. But I think it's folks like Sam Tripoli and maybe even us who are building communities, you know, like Sam has all these folks who will come out and see him perform, even though he's been pretty much, you know, blackballed from the more mainstream comedy sectors. And then you have Owen Benjamin, who came on to his show this past week, and they were talking a lot about this as well, like going off the grid. And Owen, kind of same thing, got pretty much defamed, so to speak. He was very famous as a comedian, said some things that people didn't like, and then the PC people basically canceled him, right? That's what they're calling it. Then he moved to Idaho and started his own thing, and now he has this like documentary called Beartaria. Him and his friends are building houses out of stone. But one thing that he mentioned that was, more particular to my point is that he was able to arrange his own comedy tour with fans who would say, email him and say, hey, I have a barn. You're more than welcome to do a show here. So he created his own decentralized comedy tour, totally outside of the normal system. So I think, to your point about the Canna Festival, I think it's going to be something like that where folks who are in tune with synchromysticism, for example, and like the work you put out and Ross Ben's work, it's going to be on them to find it, and they're going to participate in the synchromysticism to come and be a part of it, in that sort of bringing it back to the old, but also integrating the new, in the same way that you just synchronistically ran into this guy from Peru, a place that you have a connection to. I think the internet, if we can use it wisely, like in Owen Benjamin's case, we can live off the grid and be decentralized, but create our own system through which we can communicate with huge groups of people. We're not limited like we used to be to a geographical location.
That is undoubtedly happening. There's undoubtedly, the communities being built. And so again, with let's go back to the Trickster idea. And you're absolutely right about, comedians and their role within like playing those types of archetypes. But, the occurrences, everything about our culture, everything about like, the way we live was created and scripted. And then, the collapse is for the most part, whether you want to look at it as like it's like the dominoes falling. There's a degree of randomness in terms of what it will look like, but, it was kind of set up a certain way. That was all set up by the Trickster, like in terms of an archetype. And so by recognizing that, and so this goes back to that email, because the email was talking a little bit about the questions of like what our thoughts are in terms of like, the and maybe we'll go through some of those examples, but the truth is all of this stuff, becoming aware of it makes it clear as to what you want to be a part of, what you don't want to be a part of, and then finding those like-minded folks. And if it wasn't for the circumstances that are occurring, well, that probably would not happen. There would not be a motivation. And that's like, that's the whole idea of like how the Trickster moves things forward. Like it's not, depending upon your perspective, it can be comfortable or uncomfortable, but undoubtedly that is the hand behind these what's going on now.
I agree. Yeah, I think the Rosicrucians kind of got my interest in the past few months, but I'm almost coming to the conclusion that it's not one group. I mean, it's just a role that's played by many groups in conjunction with one another.
Well, that's the cool thing about archetypes is the fact that an archetype goes through culture. like it is not limited by cultures or individual people. Like, every culture has a trickster in a certain way, the adversary, the person who does the opposite, though it can vary in specifics from culture to culture. And so, like it's certain things are always played by different people, and the Rosicrucians, I think, are one of the most interesting people, because I've thought so much about it, because I've spent time in the camp where, like, the Rosicrucians are the good guys. Oh, the Rosicrucians are the bad guys. And that's the whole irony of the trickster, is because where you're going to meet it is going to set the whether or not the definition is trickster is the good guy moving us forward and getting more enlightenment, or trickster is the bad guy who's destroying all that I know and love.
Mm.
And the Rosicrucians fit both of those.
Yeah, I've fallen under the same spell, so to speak. I had a book called The Secret Doctrine of the Rosicrucians that I got at the Shining Lotus bookstore in Denver, Colorado, maybe five years ago. And,
all right.
And I'm looking through this book and I'm like, Secret Doctrine of the Rosicrucians. This is all chakra and yoga stuff. And then I realized, there's been 60 years of people getting the same book and then just rewriting the same stuff, under their authorship and saying like, oh, these are the techniques to heal your chakras. So I found, pretty quickly that the secret doctrine wasn't so secret, but maybe that was part of it too. It's like, hey, let's put all of our most obvious information in this book called The Secret Doctrine, so then nobody finds out what we're really all about.
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to, at some point you got to jump right in, right? Like where you don't know something and then you jump right in and then you don't know what is what. You don't know what is true, what is false, what is fantasy, what is not. And particularly when you want to go into, the mysteries. Mm. And so that has to be part of the process. Part of the process is getting lost to at least get your bearings. And so, even more so, it's like, what was the phrase you used? Like, I went down that spell or something like, you said a phrase in a certain way, which I interpreted kind of like had like a tinge of judgment to it. And in my opinion, like that is the initiation. Initiations are never pretty. They're never comfortable, but the initiation into like going into like just the general quote unquote mysteries is the fact that you got to go and realize like there are all sorts of tricksters there too, but you're not going to learn that until you begin to look around and compare and see, and like, you get the discernment, and that only comes with wisdom. How do you get wisdom? By making bad choices. Right. So like that is part of this process seemingly. And like, to me, when I choose to look at the trickster as an archetype, like that's the first thing, is recognizing that. And then secondly is like, being able to answer that question, on various levels of consciousness. And what I'm thinking like, on one level is, as it relates to tricksters, the tricksters who are useful idiots, that's a phrase that really means something. It has a real implication about consciousness. And then you've got like the tricksters, which are, and I'll just use this word in a general sense, the Satanists, or completely self-serving or egotists. And then you got the tricksters who are like, listen, this was always temporary, and now it's time for it to come down. So it's, this has always been the process. I'm going to bring it down. This is my job. It's not personal.
Like the role that they're playing, it's just a role. it's reminding me of what Chance and I talked about with, some people are just, they come into this life to do evil things, and maybe in the grand scheme of things, if it wasn't for Team Dark, so to speak, doing, showing where the Matrix has, a weak point or whatnot, then we wouldn't evolve. It's like a type of evolution. Like the lion is constantly pushing the prey animals to, go beyond their already set abilities to survive, and the lion is then pushed to be more, cunning or whatnot, lioness in the case of lions. But this balance of predator and prey seems like maybe on a spiritual level, on a higher level than just animals attacking and eating one another. I think it seems inevitable, going back to the yin and the yang and the duality thing. And I'm wondering, is this part of our movement to the next age, the age of Aquarius, where we're getting out of duality, or is duality just the lesson that we learned and now we understand it, move forward? There's no going back. Duality's here to stay, but we have to be able to move on to the next lesson that Aquarius is teaching us, because the Piscean lesson is over.
So there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, which you just said, which I want to respond to. But I really think once the questions you're posing, will ultimately come down to the awareness, the consciousness, the choice of the person who's asking that question, like how they want to play. Like as you become maybe more and more aware, or less and less identified with unconscious or hidden sort of things, well then how you choose to answer that question, or what you think is the foundational level, will change. And so I'm going to go specifically what I meant by that general. Hold on for one second. So I would say, my thought is on how you position that question. Everything in the reality of, and the reality with the lens which you see reality, which deals with precession of the equinoxes and age of Aquarius and stuff like that, by definition is duality. That's part of the makeup of duality consciousness. Seeing this, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's part of it. As long as you see that, and these tricksters, there's a certain level of trickster that continues to shape life on Earth, whatever that means, so that it looks like the story of the precession of the equinoxes. Okay, now we're going to take down the age of Pisces sort of symbology and introduce Aquarian symbology, however we see fit. And when we as the individual, someone who's got some degree of awareness, hey, I'm a human being living on Earth, and I recognize that what I bring to observing my experiential reality literally determines it. Once you kind of move, if you are seeing it from the lens of the precession of the equinoxes, as this is just how it is, well then it's just moving from duality to duality experience. But if you're well, hold on, that in itself is not a baseline reality occurrence. That's just a very foundational one of our, culture right now, our Western civilization, if you will. And I can see how that actually plays out. And I can see that it's real on a certain level. But when you realize that it's not, and you can ground yourself primarily there, then I think you're outside of the duality world. And like maybe from that level, like, you know, that's when you're like, well, I'm still here. How do I go and I interact? How do I go and I interact with, like, you know, what I do in my day-to-day life? What role am I going to play? Am I the good guy? Am I the bad guy? Am I not playing in the game at all or just watching it? Like, you know, that to me is where I think it gets really exciting. But, you know, that has to be true for the individual. Like, you know, where they are is where they are.
What I'm getting now is like the trickster is like the mascot for the apocalypse. What are your thoughts on that?
A certain level, definitely. Like, you know, it's there is, and it really depends upon how you want to look at it. Did you ever see the video? I think it's called My Pet Goat 1.
Yeah.
All right.
It's very, very, very unsettling.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And so, can you remember the details? If I go into something specific, will you know what I'm talking about?
I hope so.
I hope so. Okay. So there was like, do you remember the scene like where the guy, he's kind of like a Jesus-y looking character,
yes,
and he's on like the canoe and he goes into the cave?
Yes. And
then you see this other guy who's kind of like, he almost looks like an Ed Burton character, like with the top hat and the white.
Burton?
Tim Burton, yes.
Tim Burton character, yes.
Tim Burton character. Do you know who I'm talking about? And he's like jumping and diving. He's kind of like orchestrating it.
Yes.
That's the trickster. That's how I see the trickster. Or like, or on like the higher level trickster. Like that guy is very much involved in the destruction, but then he's also involved in the destruction in terms of bringing this guy through.
Yeah.
Through the entire process.
Right. Like the Jiminy Cricket character almost.
Like the Jiminy Cricket character. Exactly. We see this character in all of these different sort of lights, in a lot of our mythology, and, you know, the way they want us to frame up understanding life. We see that a lot. And so that being said, so I want to go, do you have that email in front of you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's, should we read it? You think?
Why don't you read at least the middle of it where like, he's talking about, and he's asking specifically about some specific things, like, you know, his question.
Right. So he's asking us about the topic and the tactic, more specifically, of muddying the water in order to discredit, or maybe some would call it limited hangout. Then he asks if we think that they sprinkle false information or unverifiable fantastical information into the mix to spoil the narrative, specifically the Epstein child sex trafficking and the fixation within some conspiracy circles on the unverifiable occult ritualistic adrenochrome aspects and the glossing over of the verifiable aspects of his business and personal relationships. I see similar things within most conspiracies, and he puts that word in quotations, and I see it as a very powerful tool to delegitimize anyone who questions state-sponsored narratives. The entire QAnon psychological operation can be seen in this light, as can magnetic nanobot graphene vaccine narratives, or even the pre-planted explosive narrative of 9/11. That is not to say that all the unverifiable things are necessarily false. It is just that a more persuasive way to lift the veil on subtle reality to the uninitiated is to stick to the verifiable. The pharmaceutical companies lobby our government and exchange personnel with the FDA and WHO, and they are the only ones left paying for advertisement on legacy media. Thus, you probably don't need their vaccine, since the people telling you to take it are directly implicated in the funding of and release of the virus. Maybe the buildings were imploded, but regardless, why weren't the generals in in charge of protecting our airspace demoted for catastrophically failing in their job? Why did Pakistan's ISS general fund the attack? What is the relationship between the CIA and the ISS? What is the relationship between the Bush family, the Carlyle Group, and the Bin Laden family? Then he apologizes for his long message and then synchronistically asks for a take on the Holy Mountain, which is interesting because I've been on a podcast twice called Oral Hygiene, and my friend Matt kind of asks you to watch a documentary and then come on the show to comment on it. And that was the last thing he asked me to watch, and we were supposed to do an episode together on the Holy Mountain. So it's interesting. But
I like that setup for a podcast.
I think you'd
watch a documentary and then discuss it. Oh, that's a really, or watch anything and then discuss it. I think that's a really cool thing. As a side note,
I think we should include you in that, and that would be a side note. But in response to
all right, I'm down with that. So let's go back to the email. First off, like, I'm so psyched. Like, we've got something to work with. Someone sent something out. So you go first. What were your initial thoughts in terms of that email and everything we've been talking about?
Well, it's definitely apocalyptic, that's for sure. But it brings to mind, I agree with him. I think I have a fair amount of skepticism when I look into things, and I do entertain a lot of things, but I do like to maybe stay as balanced as I can, where I'll discuss something and then, I don't know, people have heard me talk about this, and people have probably heard my episode with Sam on Tinfoil Hat, but I tried to give Aleister Crowley a kind of a fair spread and talk about his good points and bad points. And then after I mentioned some of his bad points and tried to go back to his good points, Sam got really mad and was like, "What are you talking about? This guy sucks," So that I've definitely been in the position where, that's kind of, happened to me, where I try to be more of like fair and neutral, and somebody who's a little more emotionally invested is like, well, don't be so neutral, take a stance. And I think that's what happens. This is what this guy's talking about, is people take a stance when they're discussing certain topics, and it muddies the water or delegitimizes the subject because, like he points out, well, maybe if people weren't talking so much about adrenochrome, they would have realized that Epstein was working with Bill Gates, was working with all these different people. So I totally agree with his larger point that, they use fantastical aspects of conspiracies to discredit the larger line of thinking, and maybe even give the appearance of like a psychological dysfunction where, most people who are interested in this stuff are highly intelligent. And that's really what's going on. They're a functional person in a dysfunctional world.
Yeah, definitely so. Definitely so. That was a nice illustration you made with your experience on Sam's show. My thought to his question was like, yes to all of it, like everything we're talking about. And it really depends. Like, this is where, maybe self-awareness, of where you're coming from and other people are coming from, like, really comes in handy, because, depending upon, what you're trying to ascertain, and depending upon how you understand the world and what you think the world is going to dictate how you will go and look at this trickster narrative in these examples. So, there's a certain level implied when talking about, like, the real nuts and bolts of these scenarios of like, they're real people and they're real organizations, and this really happened. And, like, before we get into anything really deep. Like we just need to sit there for a little bit. And that is really, that is profound for a person that has certain level, like there's a certain level of reality where they're like, okay, this is real. This is solid. This is good. This is the way it is. And then like there's corruption on top of it. But like the foundational level, like whatever that may be, this we can build upon. And so when you're looking at like beginning to realize like these institutions that we have been sold on throughout our lives as being like, the gold standard of whatever they are, that they're in actuality, it's not what you think it is. Like, that makes sense. That's where someone should be. But if you're at a level of reality where you're like, well, hold on, I know by default it's all fake. I know it's all fake, or whether the fake being that it is just purely corrupt, or fake being like the entire culture, like all of this is like, this is when we talk about the calendar, like at the level of like where the culture share an agreement upon what day of the week it is, like they're all complicit. That's all sort of fake. And so this you can't speak to someone at a level. If you can see all of these different levels, and you can only get to those different levels by spending time there, like contemplating, thinking, looking at it from that perspective. Until you've done that, you don't know they exist. Like, this is what the Trickster shows us all of this. And so there is a level in which you can identify the person and if you're having a conversation with them, what their level is. And then you also realize like what your level is. And then you realize like, all of those things are true too. Like, there is a lot of disinformation. Like, the 9/11 one, I'm going to focus upon that. So the falling of the towers, we're told that either they fell naturally by the result of an airplane or airplanes, or we're told that it's controlled demolition, or we're told that it's an exotic weaponry, all of these different sort of things. And then you have, the other elements like, well, did a plane actually hit it? It was a missile that hit it, like all of these different things. And I don't know, which, maybe it's all three, maybe it's none, maybe it's a combination, who knows? But when you're at a level where that doesn't matter, well, then that doesn't matter. And so there's an element of recognizing who you're talking to and where they're coming from. And when you're talking to people with a variety of flexibility in terms of their perspective, like to me, that's really, really exciting. Kind of like what you were what the conversation we're having right now. But then the other thing is like looking at the actual people who are involved and, the tricksters, the people who were involved with like, let's say insider trading, or the people who were involved with all of these different levels of making things happen. Like those people have different levels of consciousness, and this is like the useful idiot is someone who doesn't even realizing that they're doing something, that they're fitting into someone else's plan and they don't see how they fit into it. They're doing what they think is true to their perspective or right in their perspective, but they are being manipulated from someone who's got greater awareness. There's some people like, who are just like naturally very, very, psychopathic and focused just upon their, survival of the fittest, and their survival is the most important. Then you have, other people that maybe see this as part of like a much larger game, whether it is the controlling of culture based upon like the precession of the equinoxes. So, going back to the original question and the original point about like manipulating from behind the scenes and manipulating synchronicity and Trickster and stuff like that, it will meet you as an individual where you are, and it will always give you something of discernment or bring you to another way of seeing things, a broader and broader perspective, or at least, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, that's the whole condescending nature of this censorship of information. It's like, hey, I'm a totally, normal thinking human being. I've read plenty of books. I don't need you to tell me what's misinformation or not. I have plenty of discernment, and as a matter of fact, I pride myself on that because I think that's something that you cultivate over a thinking, your years as a thinking person is a level of discernment. So it feels kind of condescending when people, and not this guy who emailed us at all. I love the email. Thank you. And his his initials are RCC, to bring the Rosicrucians up.
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
but yeah, it's feeling like more and more like we're being treated like idiots in the mainstream media's eyes. Like, oh, these people, they can't be trusted. They're reading all these conspiracy theories, and we have to be able to straighten things out because we don't want people thinking wrong it's very, I don't even want to say Orwellian, it's very Huxleyan, with Aldous Huxley. That's really what it reminds me of more than 1984. It's like this apocalyptic techno chemical future, because chemicals are a big part of it. And he mentions the graphene, being possibly a way of fantastical thinking within the whole, jab stuff. And I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I don't want to mention this researcher's name, but when I spoke to them on a phone call, I was like, wow, this person is very paranoid. I don't know how much I trust this person's research anymore. Because you've been on plenty of podcasts. Greg does a fantastic job of editing his show, and somebody mentioned to me off air, is like, yeah, Greg can make anybody sound good. And I think that's something that people need to be conscious of when they're listening to podcasts. Have a level of discernment that, like, just because somebody's on a podcast doesn't mean they're an expert. And also, just because they sound nice and good while you're listening, there might have been an hour or two of editing, little snippets here and there. Maybe somebody kept like coughing or saying a lot, but like, I don't know, there's been cases where people have said stuff on my podcast and I'm like, well, maybe I should edit that out, maybe I shouldn't. And then I kind of have settled on not editing in that way for content, just because I want to be as honest as possible. But I could see how people might take that liberty, especially in conspiracy podcasts. Maybe you're afraid of your show getting censored, so you censor out the more dangerous stuff and you put it on your Patreon. I've been on shows that have done that to me. Or maybe it's more insidious and somebody's actually editing out things that they think that people shouldn't hear. And that's when the level of discernment comes in, and you have to be able to say, like, oh, well, this host goes to commercial a lot. I don't know if I can trust it. Or not that having ads is necessarily a bad thing, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, you began by bringing up the condescending nature of, like, so the question what I think is interesting is who is the person on the other side? Who is that person who you're saying is being condescending, is saying, like, we'll be the ones who tell you what's official or what's right or what's not. My sense is, for the most part, all of them, they realize what they're doing. Like that's what they're paid to do. In fact, that's what kind of 1984 was. Part of it was about was Winston, the main character, is he was part of the ministry of propaganda, putting people down, the memory hole, right, wiping them off of the history books. And he was becoming aware of what he was doing. And so not being aware would be useful idiot and happy to have their job, and being aware and asking is this right? Who is the person on the other side? So I find that a real interesting sort of thing. But then it goes back, in my opinion, to what we talked about last time, which is the internet has always been, from the very beginning, has been designed as a tool for trapping. Regardless of whatever we think trapping is. The guy who kind of spearheaded the beginning of the project, which became DARPANET or ARPANET, he was also in charge of behavioral operations. So why is this behavioral operations guy also this computer scientist guy? They're overlapping those two. And so I think this is all. To me, all of that has been the plan, is to tell people kind of how to think. That is part of that trickster, whether they're aware that they're doing it or not. And then just like what you said at the end about ultimately the discernment which you have gained through your experience. And that is at least, one of the byproducts of the trickster is it forces you to become more aware, to at least be open to let me look at this from multiple perspectives, because I've been tricked these ways before, whether it looks nice, it's got a pretty package, or, it sounds right, or any other of these fallacious arguments, to go and manipulate how people interpret and understand the information that is given to them.
Mm. Yeah.
That being said, I think me personally, I don't look at that graph. I don't know, but I don't look at what's being said. I've seen I've seen a lot of the research, or the supposed things with the graph mean and all of that sort of stuff, and that doesn't sound too outrageous to me. But then at the same time, if it turns out to be, I'm not going to be, I'm not vested either way. To me, I'm all right, well, this is certainly, worthy to be on my radar to continue to pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was curious. And I think this guy has a really, really good point, and I'm glad he reached out, and I encourage more people to reach out with topics, because if you couldn't tell, folks, I just woke up this morning, so it's nice to have an email to fall back on. I do apologize, Mike, for not being a little bit more.
There's no apology necessary, and the question and
Sure.
the question is totally legit. The whole the Jeffrey Epstein thing, the way it unfolded, there's something so not right about it. I don't know whether adrenochrome is a thing or not. I've definitely looked at it from both sides. But what I do know is there's something afoot with how the story is being told. Even if it was just are people going to get up and riot in the streets when we say that he committed suicide? Just as a temperature gauge for what's going to shock people. Are they going to be shocked? To the whole thing being just a story to put out there for whatever reason. I think back to the temple, quote unquote temple, which sat on the hilltop on his Virgin Islands island, and how it turned out, how it was originally portrayed as being an actual one, and then you look closer, no, it's just a painting technique to make it look like it's something that it's not, and all of these sort of things. There is definitely, the whole story to me, it has an element of something's not right. And I do agree with him. Like when you look at the players, to me, what was her name? I never know how to pronounce
Ghislaine
it.
Maxwell.
Yes. Like her father is like the biggest tell in the whole thing. That is the mega group, which is behind the whole thing. I found that the most interesting aspect.
Yeah, and she's
story,
like
but I don't.
She's a Bond girlfriend type character. You know, she's got a submarine license. She's got a pilot's license. It's like
all that.
Yeah,
all that. Exactly. Her dad being the most celebrated Mossad agent in history and all that sort of stuff. So yeah,
well, and you bring up Reading earlier in our conversation, and you brought up New England being this like prep school area, you know, and Reading having the only prep school that's not in New England. And you know, growing up in New England, having that sort of insulated, very, very wealthy culture just kind of around the corner, and it's pocketed. There's certain areas that are wealthier than others in New England, but it's there, and it's really it's blunt when you come face to face with it. You know, it's very much like a strata like you would see in a country like India, you would think. You know what I mean? It's like, it's very bleak feeling to realize like, oh, wow, these people have multiple huge properties and like this is just their life, and they're making no attempts seemingly to give back to the larger community, you know, which is disheartening, but it does make you want to, you know, do what kind of Owen and Sam were talking about on the recent episode of Tinfoil Hat, which is start your own community, go off the grid, have your own property, have your own land, and just get out of the system, because the people who are winning in this system have no mercy for the majority of the people that are also in that system.
Absolutely. Truer things could not have been said.
And it also makes it really, you know, fun and interesting to investigate. Yeah, I don't know if that's out of spite or not, but yeah, just like the thought that, oh, maybe I've run into one of these Ghislaine Maxwell type characters in my like many just walkabouts through New Haven and or, you know, driving around through different neighborhoods in Connecticut as a delivery guy. I don't remember if it was Richard Grove, and I don't think it was this week, but the week before. But Richard Grove and I were talking, and Richard is the guy behind Autonomy. He's got some interesting
I know
stuff.
Richard Grove.
Cool. So he lives in Connecticut as well, and I mentioned to him like, oh, you know, one time when I was an Amazon delivery driver, I delivered to this huge mansion that had a helipad. It's right outside of the capital city of Connecticut. And it didn't really click then, but the last name Chase, obviously people are like, well, JP Morgan Chase, right? And Richard was like, yeah, that's them, man. That's not anyone else. It's not a coincidence, you know, because as a delivery guy, I'm like, listening to conspiracy theories, doing Tinfoil Hat binges, Grimerica show binges, higher side chats, listening, you know, for whole 8-hour shifts to just conspiracy content, right? And then I get a package that says like, oh, put in this gate code, and I'm like, okay, drive up to the gate, go up the long driveway, there's a helipad, the house is like the size of a school, you know? So I've come to the doorstep quite literally of that type of aspect of our society, and yeah, it's very fascinating. I don't want to go too far into like investigating and snooping around, but I think you don't necessarily have to like go and like break into somebody's house or you know, go where you're not welcome to figure out these kind of mysteries and do these investigations, you know. In a synchronistic way, my delivery job just kind of pushed me there. I didn't have to, you know, go after hours and sneak around like somebody who came at it from a different angle might have to.
That's a wild story.
It's like, and you know, with the Bush stuff too. I mean, it's really, you know, just being a delivery guy. I get put in Yale University, delivering to a house that used to be the Bush family's, walking through the house, you know, in such an unorthodox way. I think I described this on this podcast, maybe like the first episode or so. But then the same thing with Amazon. You know, I'd be delivering in these really wealthy neighborhoods and just see things that kind of stood out. And I almost felt like synchronistically I was being brought there just to observe, you know, and get a better idea that, oh, there is a reason to go further. Like, these conspiracy theories are not just infotainment. You need to look into this stuff because it's real, you know, and that's why, like, when I stood at the door of this little mansion, or not little, big mansion, and this little man with a cute white dog comes up to me and takes the package, I'm like, oh, this guy's not so bad. I don't know if that's one of the Chase family members, but he seemed like not a bad guy, but he seemed very afraid of me. That was one thing that I did notice. But yeah, it was the right place, right time, and nothing substantial. It's not like I kicked over a rock and there was like a hidden key underneath or anything wild like that. But I think just being put in a place like that is so rare, and the average person in my position would probably not take that kind of note. You know, they might marvel at the size of the house, but I would say, you know, not to speak poorly of any of my fellow delivery drivers, but they weren't looking for that kind of stuff. If they were delivering to a mansion, they were like, oh, cool, this house is huge, that's it. You know, they weren't paying attention to names on the packages or little details like I was, because I was just in that sort of mindset of everything's a clue, you know?
That's a fun way to be, I'll tell you that. I think it's a smart way to be as well.
Thank you.
So we're about 2 hours in, is that right?
Yeah. I think we might have to do something with like the extended segment. If we go past like an hour and a half, maybe put it on the Subscribe Star or something to give people an incentive to support. What do you think? Would that be too mean?
We can do that. Let's do that.
Cool. Right on. Yeah, we have been getting going off on many tangents. Is there anything you think needs to be wrapped up? Anything that we left hanging that you wanted to comment on?
Can you include the pictures I sent you? Like, is there a way to include that in this?
Absolutely. For folks who
Let's include those pictures.
Yeah, for folks who haven't looked, each episode artwork for the Your Handbook for the Apocalypse podcast has been unique. I put a little bit of time into creating a photo sort of representation of what we talked about. The first one, I think, was just your Susquehanna River logo, which I think is so cool, just the green and blue one. And then, yeah, the little crow figure is me. And then there's a figure of you, but I think I'm going to use the one where you're like sitting down with the magnifying glass that you drew yourself. I think I'm going to use that from now on. So this week's episode artwork will have what's the proper name of the craft you got at the Cannafest? I
have no idea. I don't have a proper name.
Well, I would call it like a weaved arabesque almost looking thing, but arabesque like kind of brings to mind a whole totally different part of the world. But it is kind of like it's like indigenous psychedelic art in fabric. That's one way to put it.
And so I use it to place crystals upon.
Ooh. See, now this is something.
Everything I don't make something just to make it. I make something to use it. And this year is definitely to be used.
So maybe I'm forgetting this part because, all right, so I had this beautiful staff, like this pine wood staff that Tara and I found while we were walking, and I brought it home with me because my intention was to kind of sand it down and use it as a walking stick, and maybe we'll touch on this next week or something after I actually do something with it, but I left it in the front lawn thinking like, oh, nothing will happen to it, not remembering that, my father, mows my grandmother's lawn every week. So he comes by and runs it over with his lawnmower. And at first I was like kind of very upset, like, oh, my dad, what a jerk, just runs over my walking stick with his lawnmower, completely shreds it. And then I look at it, and he actually kind of made it cooler than it was before. Now there's a spot where I can put a big crystal. So the lawnmower, in a way, actually helped me out and maybe took some of the work off my plate that I would have had to do with the saw and sandpaper.
All right. So I want to hear how that progresses, and because I always love to hear the walking stick stories. Well, and I'm almost done the one which I'm working on, so maybe I can share some pictures with that next week. Yeah.
That was my point. Is like you are very ingenious with your crafts and your artwork, so I hope to include that in the show and my attempts at making stuff too. I don't want to go ahead and call myself ingenious, but I will say, folks, if you haven't seen Mike's art before, do check it out. Can they still see it on Susquehanna Alchemy, or would maybe your Instagram be a better place for folks to see more of
I think if you're interested in seeing that, in the early posts on Instagram, I had pictures of art.
Very cool. So yeah,
but I haven't put anything out for a while.
Well, follow Mike on Instagram, send him a message there, or you can email me at mfticpodcast@gmail.com. You can also leave us a message at podinbox.com/mftic. You got to spell that MFTIC in capital letters. Go over to the Susquehanna Alchemy inbox once you're at that page and leave us a message, and maybe we'll play it on the show. So you will be on the Your Handbook for the Apocalypse show. That's the intention. We're writing this in the real. What are we going to do? The world is changing. I don't know, but Mike and I, we're going to be here each week talking about it. What do you think, Mike?
I think that's a great way to end. I hope to hear from folks. I love the playing off of their ideas and directions. So please continue to do so. Mark, it's always a pleasure. Until next week.
Right on. All right, Mike. Thanks for talking. Take it easy.
Alchemy refers to the process of something of less value changing into something of greater value. Susquehanna Alchemy is the name of a series of programs and services that facilitate inner change or transformation. Tools to assist in accessing deeper parts of ourself. The cumulative effect of these experiences is a cleansing, softening, and expansion of the inner world. Space is created, and it is in this space that the transformation will naturally occur. Susquehanna Alchemy uses art and symbols. The practice leads to greater stability, awareness, intuition, and creativity. The Susquehanna Alchemy process is recognizing our place at this point of time in history and how it connects to the past and the unfolding collective future. In this modern era, technology is the driving factor behind everything happening on Earth, either directly or indirectly. Technology itself is changing rapidly, but it is changing us rapidly as well. The course which technology is on is as dangerous as it is promising. And all of us who are alive now are intimately connected to the outcome. As an individual becomes more conscious, more aware of how their personal journey impacts the global journey, the dynamic begins to change. No longer do global trends drive the individual experience, but the individual experience begins to impact global trends. Quite literally, as we change inside, we affect change in the outer world. This has always been true, but during this time of global transformation, it becomes the responsibility of the conscious person to actively encourage their own personal transformation, even if only to contribute to the collective unfolding that is taking place.